Chapter 10 of The Dog with Golden Eyes. Toki crouched as soon as he saw Cassie, his head on his front paws, his rump in the air, and his tail swaying back and forth, back and forth. As Cassie started down the steps, he jumped up and down with wild excitement. He leaped into the air, whirled, and bounced across the yard to Cassie. He almost knocked her down. Cassie staggered. "Down," she exclaimed. "I brought you your supper." She clutched the dish tightly with both hands and hurried to the tree. Toki frolicked beside her and crouched again with his head on his paws. Rump aloft, tail still swinging, lips grinning impishly. One paw struck several times the empty air. She put the dish down carefully. "You're dancing," Cassie exclaimed. "You're doing a happy dance," and she laughed. She retreated to the bottom step and sat down stiffly. Toki swatted the dish until the inside contents were pushed around onto the ground, and he gulped it down. As usual, he sniffed at the can of dog food before he ate it. He pounced on the empty dish, shook it, tossed it into the air, and pounced on it again. He finally licked his muscle with his long pink tongue. "You sure like fresh meat," said Cassie. "I wish you liked canned food so much more. Maybe we'll try another kind of food tomorrow." His tail waved slowly. He suddenly dashed partway across the yard toward Cassie, stopped, crouched on his forepaws, waved one paw in the air, bounced several steps toward the liquid amber tree, looked over his shoulder so he could still see her. Cassie was mystified. "What are you up to?" Toki repeated his performance, dashing partway towards Cassie and then starting back towards the hill behind the trees. He stopped and looked back at her, grinning. "You want me to follow you?" Cassie suddenly exclaimed. Her whole body was aching to lay down and rest after an hour of gardening, but she couldn't imagine a worse time to go for a walk. But an invitation from Toki? It was too exciting to turn down. She painfully struggled to her feet. As soon as she started towards him, Toki began circling, leaping, and frisking. He bounded up the hill. "Oh no," moaned Cassie. There's no way she could keep up with him, but she would start out. Beyond the line of liquid ambers was a rabbit path. Cassie began to climb. She used to be good at hiking. She used to do it a lot. At first, it was just for the pure joy of it, the fun of being outdoors, away from houses and people. She had loved being in the open, all by herself, with so many rabbits and different birds to watch. And then because she wanted to be there, she couldn't bear mother and father arguing with each other. Before her father left, her parents argued a lot. I wish you'd quit fooling around with those cars from here," her mother would say to her father. "Why don't you work in a regular garage like you used to do?" "I've got my business license, so it's okay to work here." "Yes, but you'd get a regular check on time each month." "I earn more money working for myself." Cassie had wondered about that. She noticed that one red car came back pretty often. The woman driver spent a lot of time talking with her father, and he hardly ever looked at the car. The hills were always quiet and peaceful, and she remembered that there were 3 big boulders under the pine tree on top. She sat down and watched the ground squirrels and the rabbits going about their business as though she wasn't there at all. She'd take a box of crackers and cookies with her to share with the blue jays. The jays got quite sassy, scolding her when they thought that it had taken too long between bites. Cassie stopped to watch her breath and scan the hill. The boulders and the pine trees were still there, but they seemed 10 miles away. How could she ever have climbed so far? Toki was zigzagging across the slope, darting from one bush to another to sniff carefully and occasionally lift his leg to leave his mark. From time to time, he'd stop to look at her and swing his tail as hard as he could, as if to cheer her on. About a third way up the mountain, the path went around a white rock that was flattish on top. Cassie decided that if she had the strength to reach it, she would sit there, and the rest of the way, she would just go back down. In one place, the path was awfully steep. She wrestled with the temptation to give up and go home. But then she remembered, I Don't think that I'm a quitter. And she muttered, well, I'm not. And she put one foot in front of the other. And she thought about how earlier hikes had been fun and feeding the blue jays were great. And after a while, she had been eating 10 cookies for every one that she gave the blue jays. Cassie remembered the morning that she had gone into the kitchen for breakfast and her mother had told her that her dad had gone. Walked out of the house with a suitcase, and no, he's not coming back, said her mother, pulling out a frying pan. But why? Asked Cassie, bewildered. Her mother banged the frying pan down so hard that Cassie jumped. You'll have to ask him if you ever see him sometime. You mean he just took out our car and drove off? She asked cautiously. Mother frowned. No, he left the car. I think somebody else gave him a ride. Cassie wondered if it had been the driver of the red car, but she didn't want to ask. Cassie reached the flat rock and carefully lowered herself onto it. Toki came frolicking back, put his paws on the big rock beside her, gave her several big slobbering kisses. She laughed in spite of her pain. I'll have to get into shape if you want me to play with you, she told him, wiping her face. Being kissed by Toki was sort of like going through the car wash. She put her arms around him, hugged him, even as he squirmed. For a brief instant, she put her face against his fur. He wiggled away and zoomed off again. Cassie watched him smiling. His funny way of trotting almost made him look like he was bicycling. The sun dropped down behind the hill and Cassie stood up carefully. I'll have to go home now. You'll be good. I'll see you tomorrow. Toki swung his tail and watched her start slowly down the hill. When she looked back, he was gone. Back home, she washed the dog dish. She gasped. There were 2 teeth marks, deep ones, right into the metal, and a couple of places his teeth had even punctured holes. What it must have been just playing with that dish. How strong his jaws must be to make holes in stainless steel. If her mother saw that, she hid the dish in the closet, just in case. With a sack of corn chips from the cupboard, she retreated to her room and her books. Her hands were sore and her back ached and her knees hurt, but she didn't care. Her beautiful dog was worth any amount of pain. What a wonderful creature he was, and they were truly friends. Hi, I'm home, said her mother's tired voice. Reluctantly, Cassie closed the books on Malamutes and went into the living room, where her mother had collapsed on the brown chair. Cassie had forgotten about supper and about how TV. She had been thinking about the white dog and how he sniffed the canned food before he ate it. She wondered if there was another brand of food that he would like better, what he would prefer if he had to choose. Did you eat at work? She asked her mother. No, well, I nibbled at stuff. I guess you could fix me something. A new thought crossed Cassie's mind. Mom, she said, if you could choose whatever you wanted for supper, what would you choose? Her mother sat bolt straight up in the brown chair. Whatever made you ask that? I don't know. I was just wondering. You never really get to choose anything, but what they serve at the Red Baron Burger. Yeah, you're right. Her mother rubbed her forehead. Well, I'd like a big T-bone steak. There was no pause. No. As long as we're wishing, I'd wish for a giant porterhouse steak, charcoal broiled rare. There was another little silence. Maybe a huge baked potato with sour cream and chives sprinkled all over the top, and a little loaf of fresh baked bread on a little board with a knife to slice it, and a dish of real butter to go with it. And oh, I don't know, some kind of special salad that they mix up right at the table in front of you, just like at those fancy restaurants I've seen on TV. She sank back into her chair. That's my idea of a real dinner. No fast food for me. That's what I would wish. Cassie felt a little pang. Maybe someday, years from now, she would take her mother to a fancy restaurant and eat a giant porterhouse steak, rare, and all that went with it. She went into the kitchen, looked at the packaging, and found ground beef in the refrigerator. Above the refrigerator were some cookbooks, and she pulled down one that said 101 Ways to Fix Hamburger. With the book propped open on a certain page, she looked at some of the ground beef recipes and made it into 2 patties. She followed the recipe for cooking them, made a salad, put some meat patties on the plate, and called her mother to the dinner table. "Salisbury steaks, Mom," she announced. Her mother smiled. "Oh, we're getting fancy." Cassie shrugged and smiled. She and her mother cleaned up their plates. Ordinarily, she would have made 2 patties for each of them. She would have eaten all hers and whatever her mother didn't eat. Instead, she thought happily of the ground beef still in the refrigerator. Her mother would assume that it was all gone, and tomorrow Cassie would give it to Toki. Canned food was expensive. Cassie would be glad if she could just buy the dog kibble. She rinsed the dishes, put them in the dishwasher, and went back to her room, stretched out on her bed, and opened the book on Malamutes. Pure Malamutes weren't used for sled racing because they weren't fast enough. It was the Arctic Spitz breed and the other dogs that were used for racing. Cassie frowned. She went from her dream of Toki being in the Iditarod races and thought of him being in Hollywood. She read on. The Eskimos didn't like to breed a dog with a wolf because half-breeds could be treacherous. Cassie was startled. Toki wasn't treacherous. He was just lonely. And if there were any wolf in him, it was only just a little bit.